Our story begins at the heart of the Torah, with the section of the book of Leviticus known as the Holiness Code. Perhaps you've heard of the famous line, to love your neighbor as yourself? But did you know that the biblical verse immediately before this obligation commands that you rebuke your fellow for wrongdoing? Leviticus 19:17 demands, "You shall not hate any of your kin in your heart. You must surely reprove your fellow and not incur sin." The core of this verse presents us with an ambiguous yet unmistakable obligation. Hocheach tochiach, you must surely rebuke. Through this verse, the Bible calls upon its readers to stand up against wrongdoing, to speak up in the face of injustice. And yet, the Bible provides no guidance for how to accomplish this task. You shall surely reprove your fellow. But how do I accomplish this? When am I required to say something? Who must I actually engage as a perpetrator, and what am I supposed to say or do? The questions quickly multiply with no clear answer. In fact, as we begin to zoom out from the heart of this verse, we realize that things only get more complicated. Our verse opened by proclaiming that you shall not hate your kin in your heart. But what does this have to do with rebuke? Should I only chastise someone I would otherwise hate? Moving from the hatred in my heart to reproof of another person opens up an even more provocative question. When I confront someone for wrongdoing, is it about correcting them, or is it really about me and assuaging my feelings? This tension between myself and others is not the only complication this verse creates for us. Leviticus 19:17 ends by cautioning us not to incur sin. But what does this mean? Is this the sin of confronting the other person improperly? Or is the true crime refraining from speaking up when there's a need? The equivocal nature of this warning is further heightened by the ambiguity of the Hebrew letter that connects the final clause to the earlier part of the verse. V'lo tisa alav chet. The Hebrew letter vav that begins this final clause can either be translated as and or but. Reprove your fellow and thereby do not incur sin of remaining silent, or reprove your fellow but do not incur sin by excessive confrontation. Again, not enough rebuke or too much rebuke. So our verse presents us with a number of complications. Reprove your fellow. But how? You shall not hate your kin in your heart. Is this more about me or the other person? And or but do not incur sin. What's the crime? Improper confrontation or keeping silent? As we zoom out further, the context of this verse generates even more food for thought. We already noted that the commandment to rebuke appears immediately before the verse encouraging us to love our neighbors as ourselves. But aren't these two verses in conflict? Isn't there an emotional tension between loving someone and actively confronting them? What's the relationship between the hatred I'm supposed to avoid and the love I'm enjoined to express? Even the verse before ours creates problems. You shall not go about as a slanderer among your people. Rebuke and slander are not as dissimilar as one might think. Both can be challenging and even hurtful speech. So how does one accomplish reproof without the use of damaging words? The obligation to reprove your fellow in Leviticus 19:17 leaves us with much to consider. The verse itself raises questions about the role of the self and the other, and the ambiguous possibility of sin. The immediate literary context introduces concerns over the emotions of love and hate, and the misuse of judgmental speech. The issues raised by the biblical obligation to rebuke and its literary setting mirror the many challenges and frustrations that we face when considering speaking up against others. But fortunately, we're not alone in grappling with these complex problems. Jewish sources from antiquity have already engaged with many of these fraught concerns. In the next few videos, we'll see how Jews from the shores of the Dead Sea to those living under the flag of Islam navigated the key tensions and dangers involved in understanding the biblical obligation to rebuke. We'll begin with our earliest texts, which tackle the challenges set forth by the verses surrounding the commandment to rebuke, the necessity of love, and the prohibition on slander. Moving forward in time, we'll see how the early rabbis reacted to the threat of lurking sin mentioned at the end of the verse, while the later rabbis grappled with the balance between focusing on oneself and focusing on others, which I highlighted at the beginning of our verse. These many responses to our biblical verse about reproof give us insight for thinking about the dynamics and obstacles involved in speaking up that continue to confront us today.